Hi guys, my name is Lars Stender. I'm a writer from Denmark who specializes in science fiction and fantasy stories. I'm here today to read from my fantasy novel, Mandigo and the Hellhounds. And right here now I'll be reading chapter 22. If you want to know more about my stories, please check out the links at the bottom of the screen. Chapter 22, Mandigo and the Hellhounds. One of the other things that had changed while Mandigo was gone was a number of teachers who were now working at Bloodstone. Bombur might have been executed, but 3 new sorcerers now replaced him, 2 wizards and a witch. The witch's name was Cersira, and she was a dark-complexioned beauty from the mysterious desert kingdom of Suara in the south. She only taught candidates and initiates, and what her lessons actually consisted of was a big mystery. However, the novices and other students were never in doubt when Cersira had taught a lesson, because her students always had a strange smile on their lips as they came out of the classroom. Jasper had once said that it looked like cats who had just been served a big bowl of cream. The 2 wizards were very different from one another, not only in the way they looked, but also personality-wise. One was a tall, thin, sinewy, bony creature whose hair and beard were long, filtered and dirty. He had a big hawkish nose and long, claw-like fingers that he loved to dig into the necks and shoulders of his students, especially if they hadn't done their homework. His name was Null, and he taught mainly the art of waking up the spirits of the dead, necromancy, and controlling the willpower of inferior beings. By that he meant any being who had not been initiated into the realm of magic. Mandigo liked the other wizard, Todekarl, much better. Originated from Fjordby, Todekarl was a jolly, stocky guy who had a paunch and a friendly face. He was normally good-natured and so absent-minded that he often forgot what he was supposed to be teaching. This meant that his classes often devolved into sheer chaos, but on the other hand they were never boring. He knew a lot of stories and was good at teaching about various potions and medicines. His most popular concoction was a black, gritty powder that would explode when it came into contact with fire. Unfortunately, he was never able to accurately remember the recipes, so it would only work every 4th time or so. Montero and the initiates had left Bloodstone shortly after Mandigo recovered. Mandigo never saw them leave, but one morning he woke up and they were gone. Mandigo's situation at Bloodstone was a bit special. His prolonged period of illness meant that he was behind with his studies, so he had to practically start all over again. Before he left, Montero had left a special lesson plan for Mandigo. He certainly wouldn't be bored in his uncle's absence. None of the students at Bloodstone Wizard Academy had much freedom, and Mandigo had even less due to all the extra lessons he had to have, so he could catch up with the others. In the limited spare time he would go outside as far as possibly could and explore the premises around the castle. The students were not permitted to leave Bloodstone without special permission, but the castle was big and housed a vast number of chambers, corridors, and windswept parapets that would attract observers like magnets. Still, Mandigo had begun to perceive Bloodstone as an unpleasant jail. Whenever he climbed around the parapets or the bastions and looked out at the surrounding mountains, he would feel a tremendous longing and desire that would never get fulfilled. The many hours of being locked in the study chamber were slowly sucking all the life out of him. That at least is how he felt it. The physical weakness he experienced after the sickness hadn't helped much either. For a boy like him, who had been used to working hard and always being very active, it has been especially hard to suddenly not be able to run and jump as well as he could before. Every once in a while, Mandigo would be so lucky as to get invited to play ball with some of the other novices. But partially due to his physical limitations and partially because he had to study so often, it was not uncommon for Mandigo to be alone once he got off school. But one warm spring day, while Montero was still absent, something happened that would have a major impact on Mandigo for the rest of his life. He happened to have a few hours to himself, because Null had to teach some of the candidates and therefore did not have time to see Mandigo. The other teachers were also preoccupied with their students. Mandigo had homework to do, but the sun was shining so brilliantly that he simply couldn't make himself stay hunched over a bunch of dusty books when the weather was so beautiful. He decided to go exploring as he normally did, and on this particular day his curiosity led him towards the sound of clashing swords that came from an area near the stables by the west wall in the inner courtyard. It was, among other things, a place where the Dracoids liked to hang out. These monstrous creatures, who served as Mortero's force of security guards, had increased in numbers in the course of the winter. Bloodstone was now a base for several hundred Dracoids, and the last ones who arrived had built their own small barracks and camp of tents in the windswept courtyard, because there was no longer any room for them inside the fortress itself. At regular intervals, Mortero sent companies of Dracoids out to the countryside to fetch supplies. Mandigo couldn't help noticing that some of those companies had clearly been in battle and suffered losses when they returned. He was concerned about what this meant, but was hesitant to ask Mortero about it. After having overheard the dialogue between Mortero and the voice from the darkness, Mandigo had lost the last bit of trust he had had in his uncle. From now on, he would follow his own instincts and play his own game as much as possibly could. When Mandigo reached the stables, he saw that the sound of clashing swords came from some Dracoids who were fighting one another, which they often did. These creatures were actually quite combative. The slightest provocation would make them go at each other like wild dogs. In this case, however, there had been a small difference. Mandigo noticed, after he had observed the fighting for a little while, 3 Dracoids had ganged up on a 4th. He was a big old warrior who limped badly after a battle many winters ago. Mandigo knew that this particular Dracoid almost never left Bloodstone, but would always stay behind in a forge in order to repair his comrades' weapons and armor. His 3 opponents had formed a circle around him and fenced him with their primitive swords, although they didn't seem too keen on going into combat with their limping comrade. The limping Dracoid remained conspicuously calm and scowled from one opponent to the other, while holding a big, sturdy, somewhat curved, 2-handed sword before him, ready for combat. A little further back, a group of Dracoids stood, whistling and making condescending grunts in an attempt to get the 3 Hotspurs to act. At long last, one of them attempted to make an attack. He flung himself forward and swung his sword in a massive overhand thrust, and had it hit the limping Dracoid, it most certainly would have split his skull in 2. But he warded off his opponent without any problem, and thereupon hammered his fist right into the other's face, making him tumble semi-consciously back into the crowd of observers, who at this point were laughing so loudly that the timbers of the stable reverberated. The 2 other Dracoids now made their attack, but once again the limping Dracoid warded them off with a few fast and heavy blows that made both his opponents lose their balance, so that he could easily push him down into the mud in front of his forge, to the great amusement of the observers. Suddenly, a strapping petty officer emerged from the group. He brandished his sword and walked over to the limping Dracoid. "Ratch!" he grunted. The observers immediately began placing bets on the outcome of the new battle, and the petty officer swung his weapon with self-confidence and started circling the limping armorer. The limping Dracoid budged only a little. However, Mandigo noted that he stood with his legs apart as he directly faced his opponent. He made no attempt to follow the movements of his opponent or to speed up the fight. On the contrary, he calmly waited for his opponent to make his attack. When the attack finally came, it was obvious that the petty officer was a much better swordsman than his 3 predecessors. But it was equally obvious that he had now met his match. The limping Dracoid was simply much faster. Even though his sword was bigger and heavier, he whirled it around like it was a tornado with sharpened edges. The petty officer was forced to back down. The limping Dracoid made no attempt to pursue him. The petty officer shook his skull-like head and made another attack, this time much more fiercely. The limping Dracoid warded him off again and spun around. The page officer lost his balance somewhat, and the limping Dracoid hammered his pommel into the page officer's flank with such might that Mandigo clearly heard a few of his ribs crack. The page officer whined like a pig and collapsed in pain. The limping Dracoid snickered and went back to his forge. Mandigo sat for a long time thinking about what he had just seen. It dawned on him that the limping Dracoid was like an old, vicious wolf that no longer had the necessary strength to go hunting with the pack or chase the long louts that provoked it. But if they were careless enough to approach, they quickly discovered that the old warriors were still going strong. The injured leg of the limping Dracoid hindered him in being able to fight like his comrades, but he had clearly developed his own style in which he had compensated for his handicap by being able to handle his weaponry faster, more tactically shrewd than his opponents, and by using his brute strength much more efficiently. Mandigo could see a number of similarities between his own and the limping Dracoid's situation, and he now wished to acquire the Dracoid's technique with a burning desire. But how? Although Dracoids and humans lived side by side at the Bloodstone, it was very seldom that they socialized. Only Mortera and the other magicians could safely approach the frightening warriors. If any of the novices attempted to do the same, they literally risked becoming the Dracoid's dinner. Then he remembered something. Dracoids loved beer. A plan began to slowly take shape in his mind, and he hurried down to the kitchen. There he met the cook, Garner, and convinced him that Todekal wanted a big jug of beer brought up to him. It was not unusual for Todekal to want that, so Garner didn't give it any thought. He poured Mandigo a big jug of beer, and Mandigo walked away, his hands solidly braced about the jug, which was overflowing with foam. Mandigo took the jug back to the stalls and carefully approached the limping Dracoid, who was in the middle of forging a sword. When his eye caught sight of Mandigo, he stopped working and scowled malevolently down at the hooded intruder. Mandigo set the jug of beer on the table as he made sure to keep a respectful distance from the Dracoid, who followed his every move with his yellow eyes. Mandigo looked about and discovered an old rusty sword lying on the ground. He slowly bent down and picked it up. Although it was dull and worn out, it would still suit Mandigo's purposes quite well. He weighed it in his hand. It was heavier than he had expected, and he had to use both hands in order to handle it properly. He lifted it up before him and said, "Wretch! Wretch!" The Dracoid grunted in surprise, and then burst into a raw, reverberating laugh that made Mandigo's spinal cord vibrate like willows in the wind. But he remained firm and repeated, "Wretch!" The limping Dracoid's laughter had attracted a new flock of observers from among his comrades in arms, and when they saw Mandigo and understood what his intention was, they too began to laugh. But Mandigo pointed at the beer jug, looked at the Dracoid, and then repeated, "Wretch! Wretch!" The limping Dracoid gazed at Mandigo as though he thought that the boy had lost his mind. But the beer smelled good, and with a quick movement the Dracoid grabbed the jug and drank its contents. With his horned lips and big teeth, the Dracoid's mouth was poorly equipped for chugging down beer. A lot of it ran down the side of his mouth, but the Dracoid didn't seem to care. He belched loudly and put forth his sword. In 2 steps he was standing before Mandigo and preparing to make a strike at him. Mandigo warded him off instinctively, and could feel the bones in his arm rattle halfway loose as his first blow was struck. Before he had recovered, the Dracoid had swatted the sword out of his hand and, kicking him in the rear, sent him flying headfirst across the courtyard's cobblestones, making Mandigo to taste his own innards. All the Dracoids, including the limping forger, laughed so loudly that all the bricks in the keeps almost came loose. Mandigo slowly got back on his feet, blinked till the stars he saw before it disappeared, rubbed his sword behind it, limped back to pick up his sword. He grabbed a hold of the sword's handle and positioned himself before the limping Dracoid and said hoarsely, "Wretch! Wretch!" The other Dracoids slapped their thighs and guffawed again, but the limping brother in arms wasn't laughing. He just stared at Mandigo without blinking. Then he took the beer jug and lifted it. Mandigo nodded. "Zav!" the Dracoid cried as he shook the beer jug, making some of its contents spill. Mandigo nodded again, and pointed to the jug of beer with the tip of his sword. Sav, he repeated. Sav! Wretch! Beer. Sword practice. The Dracoid rumbled deeply from the depths of his chest. Then he poured the last drops of beer down his throat and flung the jug away before raising his sword once again. Wretch! He said, challenging Mandigo. End of chapter.
Oh, so before we close off here, we need to chat. We need to chat. What the fuck? So this little skinny boy with half body curved and shit pick up a sword he can barely lift and chooses the biggest, baddest fucker in the courtyard to fight him.
Yeah.
You must have had a lot of fun when you
I did
that.
I actually had to make a few pauses on the way just to laugh it one off because it was so vivid in my mind when I wrote it. So, I couldn't hear it. It was.
So let's go here. How big is this guy?
The Dracoid?
Yeah.
I would say around 6 feet and 220 pounds, something like that.
And how big would you say Mandigo is?
Oh, maybe 5'3" and around 60 kilos, something like 120 pounds. In that order.
So, in other words, he was a stone about to be thrown.
Yeah. Exactly.
By a giant.
By a giant. Yeah.
And still, he chooses to understand that if he wants to learn, he needs to prove that he is sincere.
Yeah.
And he can take a punch.
Yeah.
That's kind of what he showed here.
Yeah.
So even as he's not really an real opponent to this wretch, then he still is being seen now as brave.
Yeah. The Limping Dracoid sees him for what he is.
Yeah.
A potential earner student.
Yeah. Ones that want to learn.
Yeah.
And not ones that want to make fun.
That's right.
And again, he don't seems like he's a guy that wants to misuse the power.
That's right.
So,
I think what we see here is an acknowledgement on both parts of the intentions and skill in the other.
Yeah. Yeah, because if you can take a punch, you do have options to learn.
You have potential. Yeah.
Exactly. So, with those questions asked, we're gonna close this and then start with the next when we have some string.